Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, B&H, and thank you, Panasonic, for having me here and sponsoring me for this event. I'm not here to show you pretty pictures, so if you are looking for pretty pictures, you'll have to go somewhere else. I'm here to tell you about time-lapse, to show you how very quickly you can assemble time-lapse. And David is a very kind person. He sort of said that you've got to do this like in half an hour. My program is about a whole day long. And this is the first time I've been asked to time-lapse my presentation. So it's going to be interesting. Let's see how fast we can go through it. But pretty much time-lapse really deals with a whole series of events that happen, that you capture and that you put together, and at some point you assemble it and it becomes a video. Quick overview, a brief synopsis of what we use, and I think that's really critical because if you are not familiar with your equipment and if you don't know how to clean your equipment, you're going to suffer profusely. The whole point of doing this is to understand compression of time. So you need to understand things like duration, interval, how long between shots, dealing with intervalometers, how to program them, and then more importantly, what exactly is it that you're going to capture and how do you capture it? And then finally, we deal with things that are problematic, how to resolve those, and most importantly, if and once you gain the experience, you will deal with the Holy Grail, and it's got nothing to do with religion. Okay. So with that said, I'm going to show you a couple of videos as we go along, and there are things that you will notice and you will realize what is good, what's bad, what's ugly. But more importantly, it's really what we're dealing with is capturing individual images of something that transpires or something that moves that you eventually take a series of shots of, predetermined to some extent, and then you put those together into what I call a time-lapse video. And time-lapse videos really require not just an understanding of time and duration, but also the process of capturing it, doing the right thing. You know, we as photographers talk about things like framing. Well, I think with time-lapse framing it becomes even more critical, as you will see. The other thing is, don't bother doing time-lapse if you don't have patience. Don't bother doing time-lapse if you are not committed. We talk about, being really committed, and the fact is when you have breakfast, you are dealing with, either an involvement or a commitment. So chickens get involved, pigs get committed. But think about that, right? You have to be committed. So here's an example of what can happen with time-lapse. And I want you to notice what's going on and what you believe and think has gone right or wrong. So can anybody notice the one big problem? Yes? Pardon? Yes, there's something on there. So there's a dust spot. So if you don't have a clean sensor, think about it. A 10-second time-lapse is on average 300 individual images that you're going to have to clone or clean. It's better to clean the sensor before you start a time-lapse. The second thing is, time-lapse takes hours, days, sometimes even months. So you have to have a preconceived understanding of what the weather is going to do. If it's going to start raining and you're not protecting your camera or gear, you're going to have a serious set of issues that you're going to have to take care of in the end. So that is what I call the ugly part. The good part is that you can, if you have taken enough of a sequence, you can take portions of it and utilize it to build your sequence from. You may have cuts, but that's okay. You can blend those in. You can sequence them into other programs or other, time-lapse that you have made in the past or going to make in the future. So there are ways to solve for it. All right, given that, what are we going to be capturing? Okay, so we have things like short duration subject matter, and I always tell my students when I'm teaching that one of the best ways to do it is to use something that you have at home. And I think we all, hopefully, have vanilla ice cream in our refrigerators, in our freezers. So if you take a scoop of vanilla ice cream and you put some food color on it and let it melt at normal room temperature, we know that one scoop of ice cream typically takes 1 hour to melt. So we can calculate that a 1 hour duration will give us a reasonable time lapse of melting ice cream. Good way to practice. Similarly, you can do things like, short duration subjects of clouds. You can do long duration subjects of flowers, of, building your home or, traveling. So, there are opportunities, unlimited, as to what you can use to create various time lapses. As far as equipment is concerned, most cameras will do. Now, as far as my line of product is concerned, I use Panasonic cameras, and they fortunately have built-in intervalometers, which saves me the need to have another product and another cable to hook everything up. But you can use any camera you want that has remote capabilities of being able to trigger the camera with a product like an intervalometer, or you can use a video camera which will sequentially take images or can tune to take it. You can use point-and-shoot cameras. Anything will really do as long as it is capable of frame-by-frame capture. Now, you can use other devices to help you, but in the most part, a good DSLR or a good mirrorless camera is more than sufficient to do very good time lapses. Where you need quality, just like with all photography, is you need a good lens. And with time-lapse, the preference is to use a lens that is absolutely and totally manual, where you manually focus and you can manually set the aperture, and I'll show you the reason why we need that. It is critical that we avoid any kind of flicker, and you'll be surprised as to how our cameras generate an incredible amount of flicker, and it is most noticeable only when you're doing time-lapse. It's not when you're doing photography. It's not when you're doing video. It is only when you're doing time-lapse. The other thing is you need a neutral density filter, preferably a variable neutral density filter. Think about one thing. The majority of time-lapse is captured at a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. So if you're doing time-lapse during the day in bright daylight, how are you going to get 1/60th of a second? If your ISO is 100, your shutter speed is going to be, if you remember the old Sunny 16 rule, it's aperture of 16, shutter speed of 1/160th, and an ISO of 1/100. Well, if that's what a sunny day is going to give you, and you need a 60th of a second, then you're going to have to put some sort of neutral density filter on. Now, fixed neutral density filters will help, but they will not allow you to fine-tune to get to that exacting number of 1/60th of a second. So be aware of that, and that's how we accomplish good time-lapse. Why 1/60th of a second? It's double the frame rate. If you remember video is half on, half off. So we use the same concepts to create our time lapses, which is half on, half off. So you're using a 180-degree concept where you allow for some duration of image and some duration of no image, but a slight amount of blur to allow for continuity of visual perception, which is extremely important to give you that smooth sequence that is what video becomes as far as the individual time-lapse images are as they are created into video. A good tripod. You're going to be sticking your camera onto a tripod or a device for hours. And any slight movement or loss of registration is going to cause you more issues than you would like to have. So use a good tripod. Use things like a platypod, as we see outside if you go out to the vendor area. These are products that will help you get a stable platform to do your time lapse with. If you are a photographer who is familiar with stabilizing your tripod by hanging your camera bag from the center hook, please stop. That camera bag is going to become a sail. It's going to move your tripod. It's going to vibrate it. It's going to give you a host of problems that you will use your time trying to resolve and never be able to solve for it. So just don't do it, okay? A good ball, pan tilt head, of course, is always a good thing. Lock it down tight. The whole idea is stability and long duration stability. It's not a 1/100th of a second photograph. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs taken over a long period of time. My recommendation is to use your center hook, buy some paracord from a hobby store or from like a Joann Fabrics or something like that. Go to Home Depot or pet store and buy what's known as a ground anchor. It's a thing that you can screw into the ground. And tie the paracord to your center hook, then onto the handle of your ground anchor, and screw it into the ground so you stabilize your tripod. After all, it's going to be there for a few hours, and you don't want anything to move. All right, the next thing is, as far as your intervalometer is concerned. As I mentioned, Panasonic cameras and now a few other manufacturers have also started creating cameras that have built-in intervalometers. These will help you program the sequence for the camera then to be able to automate the process. If you don't have that, you can take an external intervalometer, connect it via a remote cable or wirelessly, program it to perform the sequence, and then let it happen. Make sure that if you're going to do extremely long duration time lapses, that you have some way of feeding power to both your intervalometer as well as your camera. And that is something that I leave entirely up to you as to what camera you have and what kind of auxiliary power system you can use. If you're doing indoor time lapses, you can use AC adapters. If you're doing outdoors, then some sort of battery power is going to be needed based upon how long your duration is going to be. Remember one thing, a single battery in most digital cameras will give you between 400 and 450 images. Your time-lapse sequence is on average a minimum of 450 images. So you are at the threshold of when your battery is going to die. Okay, be aware of that. Okay, the next thing is light. The best light is light that doesn't change or doesn't vary. So if you are doing any kind of time lapse where a lot of light variation is going to happen, you're going to run into other problems that you're going to have to use post-processing for. So in the most part, try and do initially, as you are learning the process, use daylight or use artificial light indoors to do a time lapse with. Once you get familiar with it, then you can get to doing things like day-to-night time-lapse photography, night-to-day time-lapse photography, and you can follow the principles of what's known as bramping, and we'll talk about that in a short bit. A bramping device does nothing more than automatically adjust for exposure variations, and it does it in a smooth and gradual way so you don't get jerky transitions between light change. All right, so, sorry about that. Let's just go back here. If you want to, you can take this down, but at this point, I'd just like to suggest that at my very last slide, I will give you my email address. If you're interested in a synopsis of this presentation and a series of notes on how to, please email me. I will send you a fairly detailed set of notes. But these are the kinds of durations and timings that you are going to need based upon what it is that you are photographing to create your time lapse with. So if you're doing something that is, quick, then shorter intervals are needed. If you're doing something that is progressively slow in transitioning from one state to the other, you need longer durations. Keep that in mind. And then finally, of course, you have to do a little bit of math. And the simple thing, the way to understand this, is that 30 images is ideal. 30 images per second. So for 1 second of time lapse, you're going to need 30 images. So for 10 seconds of time lapse, you're going to need 300 images. You want to be on the safe side. Your sequence should be about 450 images. If you just remember that 300 number, you will survive. Anything less than that, you'll get shorter duration time lapses. Anything longer than that, the human patience will run out and nobody will want to watch your stuff. Okay? We have limited patience, 10 seconds at best. After that, we want to see something else. That's why movies, when they are made, you do a cut from one scene to another, from one sequence to another, because we just don't have the patience to watch anything too long. So that's exactly what's going to happen to you. So if you are considering doing long time lapses, don't worry about how long it takes you to do it. Worry about how long it's going to be what you produce in the end. And if there is something that is very important, maybe 15 seconds is okay. But that's the compression of time that you are doing. That's what time lapse is. Days into seconds, hours into seconds. But it usually always ends up with that 10 to 15 second time frame. Okay? As far as framing is concerned, you run into various issues like what you are about to see. And this is when the term frame it so that you shoot loose. Shooting loose is very important, particularly for things that grow, because this was a 2-day effort that ended up with me throwing away all 450 images. And that's no fun at all, okay? And if you have one of the older cameras, by the way, your shutter's running out now, right? Because you'll do it twice, you've already got 1,000 images counted on your shutter. As far as flicker is concerned, don't get too confused with it, because things will look like flicker that are not, and things that are not, you think are not flicker are in fact flicker. Flicker is variation in exposure. It is not what it looks like. So if you think there is flicker, make sure that you read your exposure values to see that the exposure is not grossly varying, okay? Here's an example that I want to show you of what happens with flicker. Two identical camera setups, two identical exposures, two different lenses. A manual lens, 50 millimeter Zeiss versus a 50 millimeter automatically adjusting lens. Every time our lens's aperture opens to read the exposure, it then closes based upon what it is that you've set it to. If you set it to f8, it'll close to f7.9, it'll make close to f8.1, and so on and so forth. And each of those variations is a change in exposure. A manual lens will not open and close the aperture. So one of the best apertures to use for time lapse is wide open, because it'll stay right there, or to use a manual lens. The next thing you want to be aware of, and if you look at this graph, which is showing you the change, and you'll ask me, why is there still a change if you're using a manual lens? Well, our shutter does the same thing. Our shutter is not accurate either, shot after shot. And those are 450 images that you can see the variation, and fairly considerable. So aperture causes flicker, shutters causes flicker, white balance causes flicker. make sure that your white balance is set to either a Kelvin setting or a preset that is not going to vary. Please do not use auto white balance. And finally, your ambient light. Any kind of an incandescent feature in your home or auditorium or stage where you're doing time lapse will cause flicker. Be aware of that. Finally, if you are thinking about using a manual aperture lens, you can get them fairly cheap. If you want to use an existing lens that is not manual, there's a little trick. You can disconnect the lens by twisting it off. Make sure you twist it back on again. You depress the little lever that you have to allow you to see depth of field. Once you press that, you turn the lens. Don't do it if you want to at your own risk. Okay, but the most important thing is when you are using any of these things and you still see that there is flicker, there is software available. It's called LR Time-Lapse that is used to assemble your time-lapse sequences that will in fact allow you to get rid of flicker because it alters the exposure based upon the two frames on either side of the frame that demonstrates a problem. So it'll revalue the exposure settings and modify it accordingly. That's the product that I use. It is available from my website. It's not something that is discounted or that I get something out of. It's just that I know the individual who created it, and it is phenomenal, and it is used universally as the tool to create time-lapse. Finally, Holy Grail. It's really a transition that is from daylight to darkness, and your ability to change or modify your camera settings to accommodate that, to be able to create a very smooth transition from daylight to darkness or vice versa. And once you get really familiar with the process, you can even do some even stranger things like this. So that was White Sands. It was moonset and sunrise concurrently, and the ability to do that without extraneous flicker and things is something that Holy Grail allows you to achieve. And then you can do some what I call animation using dollies, tracks, 2- and 3-axis animation. As you get used to it, start spending a few $1,000s every time you want to buy a new piece of gear. And of course, as photographers, we love gas. And here's something that you can acquire with it. This is a quick sequence of doing motion animated time lapses. For those of you, as you get more experienced, and if you're familiar with doing videography, you can actually take sequences of this type and get rid of the higher rate of change that is in the ocean by replacing it with 10 seconds of video that you can overlay over the ocean to smooth things out. So there are a lot of other little tricks that you can do with time-lapse, and hopefully you can maximize what you have gleaned today and that experience to create what you want to. And this is just one final sequence. And this is the way you can start putting some titles into your time-lapse sequences, do some builds, and then finish it off with some nice music, and give the person who created the music the right kind of credits that they deserve. So don't thieve anything if you can help it. Just a couple of notes if you would like to. My website is www.shivverma.com. Notes are available if you email me, and that's the pricing of the licenses. My book, Time-Lapse Imagery, is available on the Apple bookstore. It's a little outdated. I need to update it, but at least it gives you an opportunity to start playing with time-lapse as another outlet to your photography. So with that, thank you very much. and hopefully you will all try this at some date in the near future.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Great.